Hi there. This is episode 0 of Fire and Smoke, Blight and Bloom. The story of Blight and Bloom will take place in the same timeline that The Devil at Gold Basin did. It is set in 1933, 50 years after the events of The Devil at Gold Basin, and it has all new characters and story. This episode will be an explainer of the history of the AU United States after the events of The Devil at Gold Basin, because small actions and sparks of magic can have compounding and far-reaching effects. That being said, hearing the history/lore in this episode isn't required to listen to Blight and Bloom, nor is listening to The Devil at Gold Basin first. The story of Blight and Bloom is mostly self-contained, and history and big changes are only referenced offhand a few times. They affect the backstory and motivation of some NPCs, but it's pretty easy to pick up on by itself. This episode is just for people who like this sort of thing and might want more details, but you can fully enjoy Blight and Bloom without it. Okay. Time for a history lesson. Like I said, small acts of kindness can have far-reaching effects. One small seed can grow into a rolling field of flowers over time. After the events of The Devil at Gold Basin, Florence, Jasper, Augustus, and Schur, the cowboys, returned to Tom Swaskagame to give him the mirror as they said they would. With this magical artifact and its power, Tom would have the ability to protect himself and his family and his friends from intruders and those that would seek to take their home from them. The cowboys left after that, perhaps on another adventure to stop some other infernal dangers or shadowy threats that seemed to pop up all over the West in the following years. In the ensuing decades after this, a combination of two things caused drastic change. The first was that the mirror and its nature were further discovered. For instance, after Florence, Jasper, Augustus, and Schur had sealed the devil away and closed the latch gate, that did not break the effect the mirror had and what Josephine Collins had done. Everyone from the surrounding towns that had seen it did not suddenly have the spell broken and turn around to come back. They continued to leave their old homes because, quote, the West was no good. Tom further used the mirror to make settlers move from the springs they had taken from the paw bands and to make ranchers and their barbed wire fences leave for greener pastures. Over time, this protection from outsiders was extended to neighbors to help them with their own problems. By accident, another property of the mirror was discovered. When it was held up to a different handheld mirror, that new mirror would gain similar powers as the original. Because of this, Tom was able to help his neighboring families and groups to have their own mirror for protection and self-determination. This spread out over time as indigenous people took the chance to protect themselves from settlers without dangerous retaliation. This leads to the second thing that reshaped history: fear of the unknown. All of a sudden, over the period of just a few years, lots of Americans in the West and back east saw a strange thing. Waves and waves of people moving back to the east talking about how the West was bad and dangerous and desolate and not a good place to live. So as more and more people saw a mirror and decided to pack up, many others that interacted with those go-backers were frightened about what was making people pack up and leave without clear cause. It was terrifying and was clearly spreading. Some people, in turn, decided to leave the West without ever having been shown a mirror themselves. It was also causing Americans in the East who were considering the journey to settle out West to rethink their choice altogether. Eventually, this got on the radar of the United States federal government. Huge numbers of people suddenly influxing back into states east of the Mississippi. There were reports of ghost towns and soldiers abandoning their forts to return home. Early investigations were horribly inconclusive because soldiers sent by the US to ride west to these areas and scout out what was wrong all came back talking about how much they missed their families and that it was not good to be out there, and none of them could provide any more useful information about what made them start thinking like this. However, the United States had no ability to get information any other way, as no go-backers could give any helpful information when investigated. The affected areas were impenetrable in this way and growing slowly. Then, suddenly, the problem for the United States grew exponentially and unexpectedly. From 1883 to 1900, this zone where people were leaving from was so small it went basically unnoticed. From 1900 to 1910, the problem for the US became known, but the affected areas were mostly contained to the southwest and sparsely populated towns there. Additionally, it didn't seem to be a blanket effect, as only about 95% of people from a given town could be accounted for moving back to their previous state. There would be some who seemed to stay, but they could not be contacted, and go-backers could not give any reason why someone might not have left. In the efforts by the US government, this was written off as a margin of error to do with people not being where the census said they were, or dying at some point in the intermittent journey back. However, after 1910, in only a few years' time, the area this was happening in started spreading much more rapidly. Though the US government had no way of knowing it, more and more mirrors were being created. This was not necessarily some coordinated effort. Each indigenous family and group was simply defending their own homes and safeties, and this spread out naturally as they wanted to help others around them to be able to help themselves. In a handful of years, suddenly, major problems were being faced by a completely baffled United States. Whole areas in and more states were seeing their inhabitants choose to leave. Most returned to the east. Some who had actually grown up on the west coast went that direction instead, and a small amount were unaccounted for. Systems were breaking down out of sight of federal eyes. Train lines that had just opened in the decades prior were unable to go west because of areas where tracks had been removed. Communication lines were going dark, and the US east of the Mississippi River was having trouble coordinating with the states past the western mountain ranges, except by passage through Canada or by ship through the newly created Panama Canal. Something drastic had to be done, the federal government decided. But before it could be, the US was distracted by a major recession and by being pulled into the Great War across the waters in Europe in 1917. Over the years this was happening, unbeknownst to the federal government of the United States, a secret movement had been building in the states on the West Coast, a very different threat than the go-back problem. Big business interests and local authorities on the West Coast had been seeing the writing on the wall for a few years in the early 1910s. Suddenly, the go-back zone was growing. It was spreading west and north and east, and they were seeing their own go-backers return to California, Oregon, and Washington. They were also seeing the breakdown of systems reliably connecting them to the east, to DC. And they saw an opportunity here. An opportunity to keep the coast and its resources for themselves. For a few years on the coast, in dead-of-night meetings and behind closed doors, industry leaders and local and state government figures there had been planning and pushing candidates in secret to positions of power for when the time was right. In 1917, as the United States was pulled into the Great War and sent its standing troops across the ocean and called for more, they saw their chance. In coordination, the state governments of California, Oregon, and Washington declared their independence from the United States of America and formed a coalition known as the California-Cascadia Alliance. Figureheads of business and government at once started a relentless campaign of messaging to their citizens and workers that the US was trying to pull their sons across the ocean to die in a foreign war, and that the people of California, Oregon, and Washington would not be sending their tax dollars or their children to support this. And in fact, it was time that their taxes went solely to improving lives on the coast and not those in DC. It was time for the West Coast to control its own destiny. Warmongers did not care that the common man was suffering, and their disconnect from the people in the West could be felt as the rift between the two regions grew physically, and more supply and communication lines broke down. Through their planning, the powers in the West also had another idea. The go-back zone had been tried time and time again to be reached by soldiers from the US government to no avail. Call it dumb luck, but the leaders of the newly born CCA hatched up an insane plan. They knew that if the military of the United States was able to regroup its soldiers and march its way across the West by ground, then the forces of their three young states stood no chance, even with the natural barrier of the mountain ranges on their side. Perhaps, the leaders of the CCA thought, the long-rumored supernatural force at play in the go-back zone was also worried about the full force of the United States military, now that the zone was becoming a problem that couldn't be ignored. Whatever was expanding the zone obviously excelled in its expansion through non-military means after all. Perhaps there could be an agreement that could be formed. The CCA sent not soldiers, but bands of white flag-waving diplomatic envoys tasked with finding any people that seemed to be in control in the growing zone and to offer them that if the CCA could be granted the land west of the mountain ranges near the coast, west of the Sierra Nevada in the south and the Cascades in the north, they would become a military alliance against the United States with any and all groups in the go-back zone, and make it clear to the US that any threat or incursion of the zone by military force would bring a military response from the CCA as well, if the powers that be in the zone would agree to the same for them. The diplomatic groups made contact with the people on the western edge of the zone. The CCA had no clue what process was going on there. Unknown to them was that in the zone, hundreds of independent groups were communicating back and forth and trying to come to a consensus on how to treat these offers in order to help secure their individual and collective protection from the looming military response from the US. For the CCA, a couple of terrifying months passed in silence with no word from their envoys. But then, they returned with agreements. The agreements were very complex and they morphed over time, but in short, the major sticking points of this understanding, not alliance, were that the CCA could be given the ability to remain in the land west of the mountains if they A. fully honored treaties with indigenous people still there and expanded their rights and representation, B. if they outwardly and openly espoused military support for the zone and joined forces with the groups there if the United States ever tried to make war to steal it back, C. if they over time formalized relations with any groups in the zone that wanted relations for trade or travel, and D. if they never made any attempt to do so with groups there that did not want that, and they enacted strict laws for the citizens of the CCA that attempting to move east of the mountains was a criminal offense and would not be tolerated. The agreements assured that if the CCA didn't honor any of these points or ever went back on any of them, then there was no guarantee that the zone wouldn't continue to expand west. With this understood, the CCA immediately did as instructed, as their only hope to succeed in their secession by sidestepping a second civil war altogether. They began attempts to ramp up production and industry, poured money into fortifying coastal cities and other weak points, and informed the Canadian government that allowing Americans passage through their country in order to reach the CCA by land, military or civilian, would constitute an act of war and be treated as such. While all of this was developing, the United States was in a bad position. Limited troops and funds were already overseas fighting the Great War, and the US economy was suffering from the sudden loss of connection to the West Coast. By the time they could effectively retaliate, it was too late to do so easily. The go-back zone had grown exponentially in disorienting and impossible to slow fashion, before it suddenly stopped expanding. By the year 1920, the United States of America ended at the Mississippi River. The states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and a small portion of Louisiana now constituted the western border of the USA. About 90% of the former American inhabitants on the land past the river besides the CCA had come back to the east and were greatly straining the economic and political systems there, putting a major damper on the economic upswing of the 20s. The former states of California, Oregon, and Washington now banded together, very publicly touted their alliance with the apparent source of the go-back zone, the indigenous inhabitants that the United States had long brutalized and had never given any serious consideration as the reason for the zone. The CCA was therefore impossible to reclaim by the US. Any military troops that attempted to prod west of the Mississippi River by land, no matter how they presented themselves or what plan they had going in, always had its soldiers return soon after, very confused and missing home. Canada absolutely refused to be drawn into a conflict with the CCA or the indigenous groups and their new power, maybe because of Canada's own worry about the growth of the go-back zone north of the former border. So it would not allow the United States to move military force through its country and even heavily restricted the movement of US civilians in and out of Canada. Mexico was also unwilling to enter any kind of alliance with the US or allow it to dock military ships in its ports for the same reasons. Furthermore, airplanes were in their infancy, and though they had shown some use in the Great War, they simply could not fly more than a few hundred miles at best and were useless in helping with this problem at the time. The only option left for the US would be to invade by sea, but this would be a notoriously difficult operation to pull off, especially due to reports of new coastal fortifications by the CCA expecting this possibility. And further, because any military operation would supposedly draw the ire of the indigenous groups in the go-back zone. The United States still didn't have the slightest idea how the zone worked, and DC was worried that if they provoked, then they may lose the grace they had been given that the zone had for some reason stopped at the Mississippi River. Additionally, the United States government had long relied on its citizens to do its colonization for it. It would offer incentives for people to go west, and they would do it themselves. But now, with hundreds of thousands of people having poured back east over the years talking loudly about how the West was a rotten place, there were very few people in the United States that would try and push past the Mississippi River. Those that did, every now and then, would return saying the same things. Most everyday people assumed that the gold and promises of prosperity had dried up, that the farmland must be no good, and that it was a lost cause, so they stopped trying to go. This left no viable options for the US at the time. The federal government continued to assure its citizens that this betrayal would not stand, and that the traitors would be brought back into the fold, and the rest of the West too, in fact, when the US was ready to handle that fight. With no real plan for that, however, the United States simply enacted an embargo off the coast of the CCA to inflict economic hardship on the former states, which it maintains to this day in 1933. This is what the maps in the various war rooms look like during the events of Blight and Bloom. The land to the west of the Cascades in the Sierra Nevada, just small slivers of the former states of California, Oregon, and Washington, now make up the California-Cascadia Alliance. The land between these mountains and the Mississippi River is independent, free land where indigenous groups and families act with autonomy, not necessarily as one group or a nation, but as individual actors with a common self-interest. This area is known by many as the Go-Back Zone, though the US will still refer to states and territories there that no longer exist. For now, its northern and southern borders stop at the former borders the US had with Canada and Mexico, perhaps the decision of a consensus among different groups in the zone to ensure that those countries had no reason to join the United States in any attempted military action. There are no train lines or supply lines or communication lines through the zone. Those that were there have been removed over the years. It is truly an independent area with no interest in interacting with the US to the east, and a fragile agreement with the CCA to the west, born out of necessity and worry that a full-scale military invasion by the United States might not be stopped by mirrors alone, and that some solid threat would be required to prevent the US from attempting anything at all. Finally, the 27 United States of America east of the Mississippi River, with the same borders as before, except for Louisiana being almost a city-state of New Orleans and its surrounding swamps between it and Mississippi. And also, Michigan and Wisconsin came to an agreement to transfer the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to become part of Wisconsin. Anyways, in the year 1933, the United States outwardly maintains that it has authority over all the continental land it once controlled. The coast of the CCA is blocked by a US embargo, as it has been for over a decade. And many other problems are also developing, like unnatural sea level rise seen all over the world with no clear source. Aside from all of that happening in the background, we turn to the mountains of Appalachia, where something strange is growing. Something very strange indeed. Listen to episode 1 of Fire and Smoke, Blight and Bloom to find out what awaits us in the mountains and its forests. See you there.